I'm Roxanne Patterson, 28 years old, and I built a solid career from the ground up while helping hold my family together. For years, I stepped in where my parents fell short driving Grandpa to appointments, covering for them when they couldn't be bothered, making sure he never felt alone. But the day I watched them leave him standing outside in the pouring rain, laughing like it was nothing, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever given everything to someone, only to be dismissed like you didn't matter? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not the only one. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself or someone you love, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about setting boundaries and taking back your power. What happened next might surprise you. The signs started small, so small I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. A sigh when Grandpa asked for help reaching something on a high shelf. The way my mother's jaw tightened when he repeated a story we'd heard before. My father checking his watch while Grandpa slowly climbed the stairs, his arthritic hands gripping the railing. I first noticed it during Sunday dinners. Grandpa would settle into his usual chair at the head of the table, the one he'd occupied since I was a child, and begin telling us about his week. Simple things, a conversation with Mrs. Chun from next door, a documentary he'd watched, the progress of his tomato plants. But somewhere between the salad course and dessert, my parents' attention would drift. Mom would start clearing plates before he finished eating. Dad would pull out his phone, scrolling through emails with barely concealed impatience. "Did I tell you about the cardinal that's been visiting my feeder?" Grandpa asked one evening, his eyes bright with the small joy of it. "Yes, Dad," several times, my mother replied, not looking up from her plate. The enthusiasm drained from his face so quickly I felt something twist in my chest. He finished his meal in silence after that, and I found myself filling the quiet with unnecessary chatter about work, about anything to smooth over the awkwardness that had settled over our table like dust. The eye-rolling came next. Subtle at first, a quick glance between my parents when Grandpa asked them to repeat something he hadn't heard clearly. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he was too proud to admit he needed help. So he'd lean forward slightly, cupping his ear, and ask, "What's that now?" My father would exhale through his nose and speak louder, with the exaggerated patience you'd use with a difficult child. My mother would shake her head almost imperceptibly, the kind of gesture you make when you think no one's watching. But I was watching. I was always watching. The whispered conversations started around then. I'd walk into a room and find them huddled together, voices low and urgent. They'd spring apart when they saw me, smiling too brightly, changing the subject too quickly. But I caught fragments. "Assisted living. It's time. We can't keep doing this." I confronted my mother about it one afternoon while we were doing dishes. "Are you seriously talking about putting Grandpa in a home?" She dried her hands carefully on the dish towel, not meeting my eyes. "Honey, he's not getting any younger. We need to think about what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone, or what's easiest for you?" Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "That's not fair. You don't understand the pressure we're under. He needs more care than we can provide." But I knew Grandpa. Yes, he moved slower than he used to. Yes, he sometimes forgot names or repeated himself. But he was still sharp, still capable of living independently in the small apartment we'd helped him set up after Grandma died. The only thing he really needed from us was what he'd always needed: our time, our attention, our respect. Instead, they began treating every interaction with him as an inconvenience. When he called to ask if someone could drive him to his doctor's appointment, my father would sigh dramatically before agreeing. When he wanted to join us for grocery shopping, something he'd always enjoyed, my mother would suddenly remember urgent errands that required her to go alone. The walking ahead started during our family outings. We'd be strolling through the park or browsing at the farmer's market, and gradually, my parents would pick up the pace. Grandpa, with his careful, measured steps, would fall behind. At first, they'd wait for him to catch up, tapping their feet impatiently. Then they stopped waiting altogether. I found myself becoming his shadow, slowing my own pace to match his, making excuses to linger at stalls or benches so he could rest without feeling like he was holding everyone up. Take your time, Grandpa, I'd say, loud enough for my parents to hear. I love these flowers. Let's look at them for a minute. He'd smile at me gratefully, and I could see he knew exactly what I was doing. You're a good girl, Roxanne, he'd whisper, patting my arm with his weathered hand. But my parents' impatience was growing sharper, more obvious. They'd stopped trying to hide their irritation. During one particularly painful dinner, Grandpa was telling us about his physical therapy session, how proud he was that he could walk a little further each week. My father interrupted him mid-sentence. Dad, we've heard about your physical therapy. Multiple times. The words hung in the air like a slap. Grandpa's face flushed red, and he looked down at his plate, suddenly small and diminished. I wanted to say something, to defend him, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence stretched on until my mother changed the subject to something trivial about her book club. That night, I called Grandpa to check on him. His voice sounded tired, older somehow. I don't want to be a burden, he said quietly. Maybe they're right. Maybe it's time for me to think about other arrangements. You're not a burden, I told him fiercely. Don't let them make you feel that way. But I could hear in his voice that the damage was already done. The man who had raised my father, who had been the steady foundation of our family for decades, was beginning to doubt his own worth. And my parents, the people who should have been protecting him, were the ones tearing him down. I started documenting things then, though I didn't really understand why. Little moments, casual cruelties that individually seemed minor, but together painted a picture I didn't want to see clearly. The way they'd leave him sitting in the car while they ran errands, saying it was easier than helping him in and out. How they'd make plans without including him, then act surprised when he felt left out. The breaking point was coming. I could feel it building like pressure in the atmosphere before a storm. My parents' patience was wearing thin, and Grandpa was retreating further into himself with each small rejection. Something was going to give, and when it did, I knew it would change everything between us. I just didn't know how catastrophic that change would be. The morning started normally enough. Sunday breakfast, the weekly ritual that had somehow survived all the other changes in our family dynamic. Grandpa had taken the bus over from his apartment, something that was becoming harder for him, but that he insisted on doing to maintain his independence. He arrived with a small bag of tomatoes from his garden, proud as always to contribute something to our meal. The red ones are perfect now, he said, setting the bag on the counter with careful hands. I picked them this morning just for you. My mother accepted them with a perfunctory thank you, but I could see the tightness around her eyes. She'd been increasingly on edge lately, and I suspected she and Dad had been having more of their whispered conversations about the situation. After breakfast, we were supposed to drive to the botanical gardens together. It was something Grandpa had been looking forward to all week. He'd mentioned it several times during our phone calls, excited about seeing the new rose exhibit. But as we were getting ready to leave, the sky began to darken. Looks like rain, my father observed, glancing out the window with what seemed like relief. Maybe we should postpone. It's just clouds, I said quickly. The forecast said it might sprinkle later, but nothing serious. Grandpa had already put on his light jacket, the blue windbreaker he'd worn for years. His face fell at the suggestion of canceling. I don't mind a little rain, he said quietly. We could bring an umbrella. My mother was checking her phone, frowning. Actually, it's showing a 70% chance of showers. I don't think we should risk it. Risk what? I asked. Getting a little wet? But they'd already made up their minds. I could see it in the way they avoided Grandpa's eyes, in the set of their shoulders. This wasn't really about the weather. By noon, the first drops started falling. Light at first, just enough to darken the pavement and make the air smell like summer storms. Grandpa stood by the window in our living room, watching the rain with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment, maybe. Or resignation. We could still go, I suggested. It's not that heavy. Roxanne, be reasonable, my mother said. He could slip and fall. At his age, that's not something to take lightly. At his age, Grandpa repeated softly, and there was something bitter in his voice I'd never heard before. The rain picked up as the afternoon wore on, shifting from a gentle shower to a steady downpour. We settled into the familiar routine of a lazy Sunday at home, My parents reading, me scrolling through my phone, Grandpa dozing in his favorite armchair by the window. Around 4 o'clock, he stirred and stood up slowly, stretching his back. "I should head home before this gets worse," he said. "Don't want to wait for the evening bus in this weather." "Dad, you can't go out in this," my mother said, but there was no warmth in her concern. It sounded more like an obligation. "I'll be fine," he replied, already reaching for his jacket. I've been caught in worse. What happened next still plays in my mind like a movie I can't turn off. Grandpa made his way toward the front door, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knows their limitations. But as he reached for the handle, my father spoke up from his chair. "Actually, Dad, maybe you should wait on the porch. I think I heard the bus coming early." It was a lie. I knew it was a lie because I'd looked up the bus schedule earlier, trying to help Grandpa plan his trip home. The next bus wasn't due for another 20 minutes. But Grandpa, trusting as always, nodded and stepped outside onto the covered porch. Except the porch wasn't as covered as we'd thought. Years of weather had warped the roof slightly, and rain was driving in from the side, soaking anyone who stood there. Within minutes, Grandpa's jacket was dark with moisture. He knocked gently on the door. "Could I wait inside? I'm getting a bit wet out here." My father looked up from his magazine with annoyance. "The bus will be here any minute. Just hang tight." But the minutes stretched on. 5, 10, 15. I could see Grandpa through the window, hunched against the rain, water dripping from his hair. His shoes were soaked through, and he was shivering. "Dad," I said, starting toward the door. "This is ridiculous. Let him come in." "He's fine," my mother said sharply. "A little water never hurt anyone." I stared at her in disbelief. "A little water? Look at him. He's soaking wet." Through the window, I watched Grandpa pull his jacket tighter around himself, a futile gesture against the driving rain. He looked small and frail, older than his 78 years. The man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had picked me up from school when my parents were too busy, who had never once complained about any burden we'd placed on him, stood alone in the rain while his own family watched from the warmth and safety of the house. That's when my father laughed. Actually laughed, as if the sight of his father's discomfort was somehow amusing. "He won't last much longer anyway," he said, the words casual and cruel. Might as well get used to waiting outside. The callousness of it hit me like a physical blow. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to object, to show some sign of basic human decency. But she just turned the page of her book and said nothing. I stood frozen, watching the rain pool around Grandpa's feet, seeing him sway slightly as exhaustion and cold took their toll. This was the moment everything changed. This was when I realized that the people I'd called family, the people I'd tried to excuse and defend, had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. They weren't just being impatient or inconsiderate anymore. They were being deliberately cruel. And if they could do this, watch their own father suffer and laugh about it, then there was no limit to how far their callousness could go. Something hardened inside me as I watched Grandpa standing there, abandoned by the very people who should have protected him. They'd made their choice. Now I had to make mine. I need to tell you about the man my parents were so eager to discard, because understanding who Grandpa really was makes what they did to him even more unforgivable. He wasn't always the frail figure standing in the rain that afternoon. For most of my life, he was the strongest person I knew. When I was 7, my bike chain snapped while I was riding in his driveway. I remember the frustration, the hot tears of a child whose plans had been derailed by something beyond her control. Grandpa appeared beside me before I'd even finished crying, his toolbox in one hand and a glass of lemonade in the other. "Let's see what we can do about this," he said, settling down on the concrete beside my overturned bike with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. He didn't just fix the chain. He taught me how to do it myself, guiding my small fingers as we worked the links back together. "Things break," he told me as we worked. "But most things can be fixed if you know how to look at them right." That was Grandpa in a nutshell. He saw problems as puzzles to solve, not obstacles to complain about. Throughout my childhood, he was the one who showed up. When my parents were working late, which was often, Grandpa would pick me up from school. When I needed help with math homework that frustrated me to tears, He'd sit at the kitchen table with me for hours, breaking down each problem into manageable pieces. "You're smarter than you think," he'd say whenever I got discouraged. "You just need to trust yourself." The financial support started when I was in middle school, though I didn't understand it then. I just knew that suddenly there was money for things that had been impossible before. School field trips that cost $50. New shoes when mine wore out. A birthday party at the roller rink instead of a cake at home. Years later, I learned the truth. My parents had overextended themselves buying the house, and money was tight for longer than they'd admitted. Grandpa had quietly stepped in, paying for school fees, covering unexpected expenses, making sure I never felt the weight of their financial stress. He never made a big deal of it, never held it over anyone's head. He just handled it, the way he handled everything. When I started high school, he was at every concert, every play, every award ceremony. He'd sit in the front row with his ancient camera, taking pictures with the careful concentration of a professional photographer. Afterward, he'd always have the same proud smile waiting for me. "That's my granddaughter," he'd tell anyone who would listen. "Isn't she something?" My parents attended when they could, but their schedules were unpredictable. Work emergencies, client dinners, networking events, there was always something competing for their attention. Grandpa's schedule, on the other hand, revolved around our family. Our needs came first, always. During my senior year of high school, he drove me to every college visit, even the ones that were hours away. He'd sit in parking lots reading his newspaper while I toured campuses, never complaining about the time or the gas money. When I got nervous about interviews, he'd take me out for ice cream afterward and remind me that I was going to do great things, no matter where I ended up. "The world needs people who care about others," he'd say. "You've got that in spades." He wasn't wealthy by any means. He'd worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local factory for 30 years, saving every penny he could. After Grandma died, he downsized to a small apartment and learned to live on even less. But somehow, he always found money for the things that mattered to our family. When my parents decided to renovate their kitchen, Grandpa contributed $5,000 without being asked. When their car broke down and they needed a new transmission, he covered half the cost. When they wanted to take a vacation to celebrate their anniversary, he quietly slipped my mother an envelope with enough cash to upgrade their hotel. He never asked for credit or recognition. He never kept track of what he'd given or made anyone feel obligated to pay him back. He just gave, generously and unconditionally, because that's what family did for each other. At least, that's what he thought family did. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same people who had benefited from his generosity for decades were now treating him like a burden. They'd leaned on him financially, emotionally, practically, taking everything he offered without question. But the moment he needed support in return, they saw him as an inconvenience. It wasn't as if his needs were unreasonable or excessive. He didn't want to move in with us permanently or demand constant care. He just wanted what he'd always wanted, to be included, to be valued, to be treated with the basic respect he'd shown everyone else his entire life. After Grandma's funeral, he'd struggled with loneliness for a while. That was natural. They'd been married for 46 years, and suddenly he was living alone for the first time in his adult life. But he'd adjusted, slowly and with dignity. He developed routines, made friends at the senior center, found small pleasures in gardening and reading. He wasn't depressed or helpless or confused. He was just older, a little slower, occasionally forgetful about minor details. The kind of changes that come with age for everyone, if they're lucky enough to live that long. Nothing that justified the way my parents had started treating him. I thought about all of this as I watched him standing in the rain, this man who had given so much to our family and asked for so little in return. He'd spent decades putting our needs before his own, and this was his reward. This was how the people he'd loved and supported chose to repay him. The man shivering on that porch had earned better than this. He'd earned our patience when he moved slowly. He'd earned our attention when he told his stories. He'd earned our compassion when he needed help. Instead, he was getting cruelty disguised as convenience, neglect dressed up as tough love. Looking at him standing there, abandoned by his own son, I realized something that changed everything. The problem wasn't that Grandpa was becoming too much of a burden to handle. The problem was that my parents had forgotten who they used to be when they needed him most. And if they could forget that so easily, if they could turn their backs on him so completely, then they were capable of anything. The question wasn't whether their treatment of him would get worse. The question was how much worse it would get before someone stopped them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa standing in the rain, saw the water pooling around his feet, heard my father's cruel laughter echoing in my head. I kept replaying the scene, searching for some way to make sense of what I'd witnessed, some explanation that would let me maintain faith in the people who had raised me. But there wasn't one. There was no excuse for what they'd done, no justification that could make it acceptable. They had deliberately chosen to let an elderly man stand in the cold rain rather than allow him to wait comfortably inside their warm house. Worse than that, they had found his suffering amusing. I got up around 2 in the morning and made myself a cup of tea, hoping the familiar ritual would calm my racing thoughts. Instead, I found myself standing at the same window where I'd watched Grandpa shiver in the storm. The rain had stopped, but I could still see the puddle where he'd stood, dark and reflective under the streetlight. I thought about calling him, but what would I say? I'm sorry my parents are terrible people? I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you in the moment? The words felt inadequate, too small to address the magnitude of what had happened. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and started making a list. Not intentionally at first, just jotting down thoughts as they occurred to me. But gradually, I realized I was documenting a pattern of behavior that stretched back months, maybe longer. The canceled dinner plans when they claimed to be too busy, even though I'd seen them watching television when they should have been picking him up. The way they'd stopped including him in holiday planning, making decisions about family gatherings without consulting him. The increasingly short phone calls when he reached out, conversations that ended with transparent excuses about having to go. The more I wrote, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't a recent development or a response to some dramatic change in Grandpa's condition. This was a gradual, systematic withdrawal of care and affection that had been building for over a year. I remembered a conversation from last Christmas, one I'd brushed off at the time, but that now seemed significant. Grandpa had been talking about making arrangements for his future, mentioning that he was updating his will and thinking about long-term care options. I don't want to be a burden when the time comes, he'd said, the same phrase I'd heard from him several times recently. I want to make sure everything is handled properly. My parents had exchanged one of their looks, the kind of silent communication that passes between couples who've been together for decades. At the time, I'd interpreted it as concern for his well-being. Now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. Relief, maybe? Or calculation. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but I couldn't shake it. Had they been waiting for him to become incapacitated enough to justify moving him into institutional care? Were they hoping for a decline that would make their decision easier to defend? I thought about the timing of their behavior change and realized it coincided roughly with when Grandpa had mentioned updating his will. Had they assumed they were already provided for and decided his ongoing well-being was no longer their concern? Or were they worried about the cost of caring for him eating into their eventual inheritance? The financial aspect was particularly galling when I considered everything he'd done for them over the years. The thousands of dollars in support when they were starting out. The down payment help for their house. The emergency funds whenever they needed them. He'd been their safety net for decades, and they'd never once questioned whether they deserved his generosity. But now that the situation was reversed, now that he might need their support, they were treating him like an imposition. They'd taken everything he offered and given nothing meaningful in return except increasingly grudging tolerance. I found myself thinking about legal obligations, about what children owed their aging parents under the law. I didn't know much about elder care regulations, but I was pretty sure that leaving someone standing in the rain qualified as some form of neglect or abuse. The idea of getting authorities involved felt surreal, like something that happened to other families, not ours. But what other options did I have? Talking to my parents had proven useless. They were convinced they were being reasonable, that their treatment of Grandpa was justified by his age and their busy schedules. And it was only going to get worse. I could see the trajectory clearly now, the slow escalation from impatience to cruelty. Today, they'd left him in the rain. Next month, what would it be? Would they forget to pick him up from a doctor's appointment? Would they decide he was too much trouble to include in family gatherings? The thought of him spending holidays alone, of him calling and getting no answer, of him gradually understanding that the people he loved and supported his entire adult life had simply written him off, it was unbearable. I looked up the number for Adult Protective Services on my phone, then stared at it for a long time without dialing. Once I made this call, there would be no going back. It would mean acknowledging that my parents were not the people I'd thought they were, that the family I'd believed in was built on a foundation that crumbled the moment it was tested. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was staying silent while they continued their systematic degradation of a man who deserved so much better. The alternative was becoming complicit in their cruelty through my inaction. I thought about what Grandpa had taught me when I was 7, working on that broken bike chain in his driveway. Things break, but most things can be fixed if you know how to look at them right. This family was broken. Maybe it had been broken for longer than I'd realized, held together by routine and shared history rather than genuine care. But maybe, if I looked at it right, if I was willing to act with the same courage and determination Grandpa had shown throughout his life, maybe some part of it could still be fixed. Maybe I couldn't save my parents from themselves, but I could still save him from them. And maybe that was enough. I picked up my phone and made the call. The number connected me to a 24-hour hotline, and I found myself talking to a woman named Jennifer who sounded both professional and genuinely concerned. I'd expected bureaucratic indifference, forms and procedures that would delay any meaningful response. Instead, she listened carefully as I described what I'd witnessed, asking specific questions about Grandpa's living situation and my parents' behavior. "What you're describing could constitute elder neglect," she said when I finished. "Exposing an elderly person to harmful conditions, even temporarily, can be grounds for investigation." The word investigation made everything feel suddenly real and irreversible. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. This was an official matter that would involve strangers examining our private business, asking uncomfortable questions, making determinations about people I'd known my entire life. "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll need to send someone out to assess the situation within 72 hours. They'll interview your grandfather privately, document his living conditions, and determine whether he's at risk of further harm." She explained the process matter-of-factly, but I could hear the underlying gravity in her voice. This wasn't something they took lightly. If they found evidence of neglect or abuse, they had the authority to take immediate action to protect him. After I hung up, I sat in my dark kitchen feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. I'd done something. After months of watching my parents' treatment of Grandpa deteriorate, I'd finally taken action. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just detonated a bomb in the middle of my family. The next morning, I called Grandpa to check on him. His voice sounded hoarse, and when I asked how he was feeling, he admitted he'd woken up with a cough and a slight fever. "Nothing serious," he insisted when I expressed concern. "Just a little cold. Probably caught it waiting for that bus yesterday." The casual way he said it, as if standing in the rain for 20 minutes was a normal inconvenience rather than neglect, broke my heart. He'd internalized their treatment of him so completely that he was making excuses for their behavior even when it had literally made him sick. "Grandpa, you shouldn't have been out in that rain," I said carefully. "They should have let you wait inside." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was smaller. "I don't want to be trouble, Roxanne. They do enough for me already." That was when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I'd made the right choice. He was defending the very people who were mistreating him, taking responsibility for their failures, minimizing his own needs to make their selfishness easier to bear. Someone had to advocate for him, because he was too kind and too loyal to advocate for himself. I spent that Tuesday trying to act normally, going through the motions of work while my mind raced through possible scenarios. What would the investigator find? Would my parents figure out I was the one who'd called? Would they cut me out of their lives entirely when they discovered my betrayal? Because that's what they'd call it, betrayal. They wouldn't see my action as protecting Grandpa or holding them accountable. They'd see it as a fundamental violation of family loyalty, an unforgivable breach of trust. And maybe, from their perspective, it was. But trust works both ways. They'd violated my trust by treating Grandpa with such callous disregard. They'd betrayed the values they'd claimed to instill in me: compassion, responsibility, respect for our elders. How could they expect my loyalty when they'd proven themselves unworthy of it? On Wednesday, Jennifer called to update me. The investigator would be visiting Grandpa that afternoon, she said. They'd arranged the appointment through him directly, without mentioning that a family member had initiated the contact. It was standard procedure to protect the reporter from potential retaliation. What should I expect? I asked. The investigator will assess his physical condition, his living environment, and his ability to care for himself. They'll also ask about his relationship with family members and any concerns he might have about his treatment. I wonder what Grandpa would say about that rainy afternoon. Would he minimize it as he had with me? Would he even mention it at all? Or would the investigator's questions help him recognize that what had happened wasn't acceptable? That evening, my mother called. Her voice sounded strained, barely controlled. Roxanne, did you know that someone from Adult Protective Services visited your grandfather today? I'd prepared for this moment, but hearing the words still sent a spike of adrenaline through my system. What? Why? That's what we'd like to know. Apparently, someone filed a complaint about elder neglect. They wouldn't tell us who, but they questioned him extensively about our family relationships. I could hear my father's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. He sounded angry. What did they find? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Nothing, of course. Your grandfather is perfectly fine, living independently, well cared for. But the fact that someone would make such an accusation. Her voice trailed off, heavy with implication. Maybe someone was just concerned about him, I suggested. You know how he is. He probably mentioned feeling lonely or something, and someone overreacted. Roxanne, this is serious. They could have removed him from his home based on false allegations. Whoever did this could have destroyed his life over some misunderstood situation. The irony was staggering. They were more upset about the investigation than they'd ever been about their own treatment of him. They were portraying themselves as victims of a malicious attack, when the reality was that someone had finally called them out for behavior they should have been ashamed of all along. I'm sure it will all work out, I said, ending the call as quickly as I could. But I knew this was just the beginning. The investigation might not have found grounds for immediate intervention, but it had put them on notice. They knew someone was watching now, someone was holding them accountable for their actions. And whether they realized it or not, that someone was me. For days after I made that call, everything came to a head in a way I never could have anticipated. The investigator's visit had apparently been more thorough than my parents initially realized, because on Thursday morning, I received a call asking me to come to the courthouse as a witness in an emergency hearing. Emergency hearing for what? I asked. The state is seeking a protective order for your grandfather, the clerk explained. The judge wants to review all available evidence before making a determination. My hands were shaking as I got dressed that morning. This had escalated far beyond what I'd expected when I made that initial call. I'd thought there might be a follow-up visit, maybe some social services resources offered to help with Grandpa's care. I hadn't imagined it would end up in court. But as I drove to the courthouse, I realized this was probably inevitable. My parents had spent months demonstrating that they couldn't be trusted to treat Grandpa with basic dignity. A single investigation wasn't going to change their fundamental attitude toward him. If anything, they'd probably become more resentful, more determined to prove they'd been right all along. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic spaces I'd seen in movies. There was a judge's bench, a few rows of chairs, and a table where my parents sat with a lawyer they'd apparently hired overnight. They looked up when I walked in, and I saw the exact moment they realized I was there as a witness, not as support. My father's face darkened with understanding, while my mother just looked confused, as if she couldn't quite process what my presence meant. Grandpa was sitting in the front row, wearing his good suit, the navy blue one he'd worn to my high school graduation and every important family event since. He looked fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights, older than his 78 years, but his back was straight and his expression was alert. When he saw me, he smiled and patted the seat next to him. "Roxanne, what are you doing here?" "I'm not sure yet," I said, which was true enough. The proceedings began with the state's attorney presenting evidence of neglect. They had the investigator's report, photographs of Grandpa's apartment, and medical records showing the respiratory infection he developed after being exposed to the rain. But what shocked me was how much additional information they'd uncovered. Neighbors had reported seeing him standing outside in bad weather multiple times. The staff at his doctor's office had noted that he'd missed several appointments because his rides had failed to show up. His bank records showed that he'd been paying for grocery delivery and taxi services at increasing frequency, suggesting that family support had become unreliable. The pattern was clear and damning. What I'd witnessed on that rainy Sunday wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of an ongoing systematic withdrawal of care that had been building for months. When the judge asked if anyone had direct evidence to present, I found myself standing up before I'd consciously decided to do so. "Your Honor, I witnessed the incident that prompted this investigation." My parents' lawyer immediately objected, claiming I hadn't been disclosed as a witness. But the judge overruled him, explaining that in emergency protective proceedings, immediate family members could provide testimony about relevant incidents. I walked to the witness table on unsteady legs, acutely aware of my parents' eyes on me. When I looked at them, I saw hurt and betrayal and fury, but underneath all of that, I saw fear. They were beginning to understand how serious this was. "Please describe what you observed on the day in question," the state's attorney prompted. I told the story as simply and factually as I could. The planned trip to the botanical gardens that had been canceled due to rain. Grandpa's attempt to leave for home, and my father's lie about the bus timing. The 20 minutes he'd spent standing in the driving rain while my parents watched from inside the house. "And what was your father's response when your grandfather asked to wait inside?" the attorney asked. I met my father's eyes across the courtroom. He said the bus would be there any minute and told him to hang tight. Then he laughed and said. I paused, knowing these next words would destroy whatever remained of our relationship. He said he won't last much longer anyway. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. My mother's face had gone white, and my father was staring at me with undisguised hatred. But it was Grandpa's expression that broke my heart, the shock and hurt as he heard those words repeated, understanding for the first time exactly what his son had said while watching him suffer. "And what did your mother do during this time?" the attorney continued. "Nothing. She sat there reading her book and said nothing." The judge asked me several more questions about the family dynamics, about other incidents I'd witnessed, about my parents' general attitude toward Grandpa's needs. I answered everything honestly, feeling like I was dismantling my family piece by piece with each word. When I finished testifying, the judge asked if anyone else wanted to present evidence. My parents' lawyer stood up, clearly planning to mount some kind of defense, but before he could speak, my father interrupted him. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court directly." The lawyer tried to stop him, but my father was already standing, his face red with indignation. "This is all based on a misunderstanding," he said, his voice carrying the authority he was used to wielding in business meetings. "My father is elderly and sometimes difficult. We've been trying to help him maintain his independence while also protecting him from situations that might be dangerous for someone his age." The judge listened impassively as my father continued, painting himself and my mother as long-suffering caregivers dealing with an increasingly demanding elderly parent. He made Grandpa's needs sound unreasonable, his expectations excessive. He even suggested that I had misunderstood the situation due to my emotional attachment to my grandfather. The comment about him not lasting much longer was taken completely out of context, he said. I was referring to the rain, not anything else. My daughter misheard or misinterpreted what I said. But even as he spoke, I could see the judge's expression growing more skeptical. My father's defensiveness was making him sound less credible, not more. His attempt to reframe the situation was coming across as exactly what it was, a desperate effort to avoid consequences for inexcusable behavior. When he finished, the judge turned to my mother. "Mrs. Patterson, do you have anything to add?" My mother stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, I thought she might tell the truth, might acknowledge what they'd done and express some remorse. Instead, she doubled down on my father's version of events. "We love my father-in-law very much," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We would never intentionally harm him. This whole situation has been blown completely out of proportion." That's when I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I'd been documenting things for months, taking pictures and videos of incidents that had seemed wrong at the time. Most of them were minor individually: my parents leaving Grandpa in the car during errands, walking ahead of him during family outings, the eye-rolling and impatient sighs. But together, they painted a clear picture. I also had the photo I'd taken that rainy Sunday, the one I'd snapped almost instinctively when I saw him standing there soaked and shivering. It showed him clearly through the window, water dripping from his hair, his jacket dark with moisture, while the dry interior of the house was visible in the foreground. "Your Honor," I said, standing up again, "I have photographic evidence." The judge allowed me to approach and show him the images on my phone. As he scrolled through them, his expression grew increasingly grim. The final photo, the one of Grandpa in the rain, seemed to have a particularly strong impact. "I'd like this phone entered as evidence," the judge said to the clerk. "Please ensure these images are properly documented." My parents' lawyer made a last-ditch effort to argue that the photos were taken without consent and shouldn't be admissible, but the judge quickly dismissed the objection. "These images document potential elder abuse," he said sternly. "Consent is not required when documenting evidence of harm to a vulnerable adult." When all the evidence had been presented, the judge asked my parents if they had anything else to say. My father started to stand again, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. My mother just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of remorse or shame. As I watched her closely, I realized she was crying because she'd been caught, because her carefully maintained image of herself as a caring daughter-in-law was being destroyed in a public forum. She was crying because the consequences of her actions were finally catching up with her, not because she felt bad about what she'd done to Grandpa. The judge deliberated for less than 10 minutes before returning with his decision. He granted the protective order, requiring my parents to maintain a minimum distance from Grandpa's residence and prohibiting them from making any decisions about his care without court approval. He also ordered them to attend mandatory counseling about elder care responsibilities. But the most significant ruling was his decision to grant me temporary guardianship, giving me the legal authority to ensure Grandpa's well-being and make medical decisions if necessary. "Mr. Patterson," the judge said, looking directly at my grandfather, "you have the right to maintain relationships with your family members if you choose to do so. But you also have the right to feel safe and respected in those relationships. This order is designed to protect those rights." As we left the courtroom, my parents approached me in the hallway. My father's face was dark with fury, but my mother looked broken, diminished. "I hope you're happy," my father said through gritted teeth. "You've destroyed this family over nothing." "I didn't destroy anything," I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "I just brought the truth to light." And that's when my mother finally broke down completely, sobbing in the courthouse hallway as the reality of what they'd lost, not just their relationship with Grandpa, but their relationship with me, finally hit home. The immediate aftermath of the court hearing was surreal. Grandpa and I walked out of the courthouse together, both of us still processing what had just happened. The man who had been standing in the rain just 4 days earlier was now under the legal protection of the state, and I was his court-appointed guardian. "I never thought it would come to this," he said quietly as we sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot. "I knew things had been difficult, but I never imagined they truly felt that way about me." Hearing him say that broke something inside me. He'd spent months making excuses for their behavior, convincing himself that their impatience and cruelty were just signs of stress or busy schedules. The idea that his own son could laugh at his suffering had never occurred to him because it was so far outside his own character that he couldn't imagine it in others. "I'm sorry you had to hear those things," I said. "And I'm sorry I didn't act sooner." He reached over and patted my hand with his weathered fingers. "You did what needed to be done. That takes courage." We drove to his apartment, and I helped him settle in. The place looked exactly the same as always, neat and tidy, with his carefully tended plants on the windowsill and framed photos of family members who no longer treated him like family. But something felt different now. The loneliness that had permeated the space seemed less oppressive, replaced by something that might have been hope. "What happens now?" he asked as I made us both tea in his small kitchen. "Well, legally, you're protected. They can't just show up here or make decisions about your care without going through proper channels. And if they violate the restraining order, there will be real consequences." And practically? I sat down across from him at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd helped me with homework 20 years earlier. Practically, we figure out what you need to be safe and comfortable, and we make sure you get it. No more standing in the rain. No more missed appointments. No more being treated like you're expendable. He smiled at that, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. You know, I was starting to think maybe they were right. Maybe I was becoming too much trouble. Maybe it was time to just step back. "Grandpa, you're 78 years old, not dead. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect for however many years you have left. And anyone who can't manage that basic level of human decency doesn't deserve access to you." Over the next few weeks, we developed new routines. I took over the responsibilities my parents had been neglecting, driving him to medical appointments, helping with grocery shopping, including him in plans instead of treating him like an afterthought. It wasn't always easy, and I had to adjust my own schedule significantly, but it was honest work. There were no hidden resentments or ulterior motives, just the straightforward effort of caring for someone who had cared for me. Grandpa began to bloom under the attention. His health improved, the respiratory infection cleared up, and his energy levels increased. More importantly, his spirit seemed to revive. He started telling stories again, sharing memories and observations with the enthusiasm of someone who knew he had an interested audience. He also started talking about the future in ways he hadn't for months. He wanted to plant a larger garden in the spring. He was considering joining a woodworking class at the senior center. He mentioned possibly getting a small dog for companionship. I had started to feel like I was just waiting, he told me one afternoon as we worked in his garden together. Waiting to become more of a burden, waiting to lose more independence, waiting to die. But now I feel like I'm living again. My parents, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. No phone calls, no text messages, no attempts to contact either of us. I'd expected anger, maybe even legal challenges to the court's decision. Instead, there was just nothing. It was as if they'd decided that cutting us off entirely was easier than confronting what they'd done or trying to make amends. The silence was almost more damning than their previous cruelty. It confirmed that their treatment of Grandpa hadn't been the result of stress or overwhelm or poor judgment. It had been a calculated decision to withdraw their care and affection, and when they'd been called to account for that decision, they'd chosen to walk away entirely rather than acknowledge their wrongdoing. About 6 weeks after the court hearing, I ran into my mother at the grocery store. She looked older, more fragile somehow, and for a moment I felt a pang of something that might have been sympathy. But then she spoke. "I hope you know what you've done," she said, her voice cold and brittle. "You've destroyed our family over an old man who probably won't even remember your name in a few years." The casual cruelty of it, referring to Grandpa as an old man, as if he were a stranger rather than her father-in-law of 30 years, reminded me exactly why I'd made the choices I had. This wasn't grief or regret speaking. This was the same callous disregard that had led to him standing in the rain in the first place. "I know exactly what I've done," I replied. "I protected someone who needed protecting from people who were supposed to love him." She turned and walked away without another word, and I realized that whatever relationship we'd had was truly over. There would be no reconciliation, no gradual healing, no family dinners where we pretended everything was fine. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. But as I drove home to pick up Grandpa for our weekly dinner together, I found I wasn't mourning what I'd lost. Instead, I was grateful for what I'd gained, the chance to build something honest and caring from the wreckage of what had come before. That evening, as we sat in his favorite restaurant sharing stories and laughing at his gentle jokes, I watched him carefully cut his food with hands that were steadier than they'd been in months. His eyes were bright, his smile genuine, his voice strong as he told me about the novel he was reading and the documentary he wanted us to watch together. This was what family was supposed to look like. Not perfect, not without challenges, but built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine care. And if achieving that meant walking away from people who couldn't or wouldn't provide it, then that was a price I was willing to pay. "Thank you," he said quietly as I walked him to his door that night. "For what?" "For remembering that I'm still here. For treating me like I matter." "You do matter," I told him, and meant it completely. "You matter more than they ever deserved." 6 months later, I was sitting in Grandpa's new living room, watching him teach my neighbor's 8-year-old daughter how to play chess. His hands moved the pieces with deliberate care while he explained the strategy behind each move, his voice patient and encouraging as she struggled to understand the game's complexities. "The queen is the most powerful piece," he was telling her, "but she's not the most important. See, if you lose your king, the game is over, no matter how many other pieces you have left." I smiled at the metaphor, wondering if he realized how perfectly it captured what had happened to our family. My parents had thought they were the most powerful pieces on the board, the ones who got to make all the decisions about how the game was played. But they'd forgotten that some things are too important to sacrifice, even for strategic advantage. The girl, Emma was her name, moved her knight tentatively and looked up at Grandpa for approval. He nodded encouragingly and helped her see how the move opened up new possibilities for her next turn. She beamed at his praise, and I could see why she'd started asking when Mr. Patterson would be available for their weekly chess lessons. This had become our new normal. Grandpa had moved into a small house just 3 blocks from my apartment, close enough that I could check on him daily, but far enough that he maintained his independence. He'd joined the senior center, started volunteering at the library, and somehow become the unofficial grandfather figure for half the neighborhood kids. "Your grandfather is a treasure," Emma's mother had told me the week before. "Emma talks about him constantly. She says he's the only adult who explains things like she's smart enough to understand them." That was Grandpa in a nutshell. He had always treated people, regardless of age, like they were capable of more than they realized. It was one of the qualities that had made him such an effective father figure and grandfather, and one of the reasons my parents' treatment of him had been so particularly cruel. The court-ordered counseling sessions had lasted 3 months, though I wasn't sure how much good they'd done. My parents had attended every session as required, but from what the counselor told me afterward, they'd spent most of the time justifying their behavior rather than examining it. "They seem to view your grandfather's aging as something that was done to them rather than something that happened to him," she'd explained. "Until they can shift that perspective, real change is unlikely." The restraining order was still in effect, though it had been modified to allow supervised visits if both parties agreed. So far, neither Grandpa nor my parents had expressed any interest in that option. The silence that had begun in the courthouse hallway had stretched into months, and I was beginning to think it might be permanent. I found myself surprisingly okay with that. I'd grieved the loss of the parents I'd thought I had, the people I'd believed them to be before I saw who they really were when tested. But I'd also discovered strength I didn't know I possessed, and built something better from the pieces that remained. "Your move, Roxanne," Emma announced, having apparently finished her game with Grandpa and reset the board for a new opponent. I joined them at the chess table, letting her explain the rules to me with the same patience Grandpa had shown her. As we played, I listened to him telling her about the cardinal that visited his bird feeder every morning, the same stories he'd tried to share with my parents before they'd decided his observations weren't worth their attention. "Cardinals mate for life," he was saying. "Once they find their partner, they stay together through everything, building nests, raising babies, migration. They take care of each other." Emma considered this seriously. "Like married people?" "Like the best married people," he agreed. "The ones who remember that taking care of each other is more important than anything else." After Emma went home, Grandpa and I sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was peaceful in a way that our old family gatherings had never been. No underlying tension, no careful navigation of sensitive topics, no wondering when someone would say something cruel disguised as humor. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Losing them?" I thought about the question seriously before answering. I regret that they made choices that led to this. I regret that they couldn't be the people you deserved them to be. But I don't regret protecting you from continued harm. He nodded slowly. I spent so long trying to understand what I'd done wrong, how I'd become such a burden to them. It took me a while to realize that the problem wasn't with me. It was never with you, Grandpa. You were just convenient to blame because you couldn't fight back effectively. Well, he said with a small smile, turns out I had someone willing to fight for me. The cardinal he'd mentioned to Emma chose that moment to land on the porch railing, bright red against the darkening sky. We sat in comfortable silence, watching it. Two people who'd learned that sometimes the family you build is stronger than the one you're born into. That night, as I drove home, I thought about the different ways a story can end. The version my parents would tell, if they told it at all, would probably cast me as the villain, the ungrateful daughter who destroyed a family over a misunderstanding. They'd focus on their own hurt and bewilderment, their shock at being held accountable for behavior they'd convinced themselves was reasonable. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was about an elderly man who'd given everything to his family and found himself abandoned when he needed them most. It was about recognizing that silence in the face of cruelty is complicity, and that sometimes love requires difficult choices. Most importantly, it was about learning that justice doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or immediate consequences. Sometimes it's as quiet and steady as an old man teaching a young girl to play chess, as simple as ensuring someone has a warm, dry place to wait for the bus. In the end, the most powerful thing I'd done wasn't exposing my parents' cruelty in court or obtaining legal protection for Grandpa. It was choosing to build something honest and caring in place of what they'd destroyed. It was deciding that loyalty to family means loyalty to what family should be, a source of support and love and dignity, not blind allegiance to people who'd forgotten those values. The truth had indeed come to light, just as I'd hoped it would. And while it hadn't fixed everything, it had created space for something better to grow. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. That was my story of standing up for my grandfather when no one else would. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to protect someone you love from their own family? What would you have done if you were in my shoes? If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more true stories, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.